wasn't researching earthquakes. That wasn't what brought me to the archives of the Missouri Historical Society on a gray afternoon in October. I was tracking architectural timelines in the Mississippi Valley, trying to piece together when certain building techniques appeared in frontier settlements and who brought them. Standard historical research, dry, methodical. The kind of work that involves dusty ledgers and handwritten journals that haven't been digitized yet. I'd been at it for weeks, cross-referencing construction dates, comparing building materials mentioned in different accounts, looking for patterns. But then I found Henry Schoolcraft's travel journal from 1821, and everything shifted. Schoolcraft was a merchant, not an explorer or a scientist, just a practical businessman traveling the Mississippi River trade routes, recording what he saw because accurate information meant better business decisions. Detail-oriented, the kind of person who writes down the number of houses in a town, the condition of the roads, the types of goods available for trade. The kind of person who records what he sees, not what he imagines. In 1821, he traveled down the Mississippi expecting to find New Madrid, Missouri. He'd heard about the earthquakes a decade earlier, everyone had. Massive ground shaking felt from Canada to the Gulf. The Mississippi River running backwards. Stories that sounded impossible, but were documented by too many witnesses to dismiss. Dramatic, yes. Devastating, certainly. But Schoolcraft was a merchant. He understood that markets recover, towns rebuild, trade routes get reestablished. It had been nearly 10 years since the earthquakes. That's plenty of time for reconstruction, for commerce to resume, for a strategically located trading town to not just survive, but potentially thrive. He expected to find New Madrid rebuilt, functioning, maybe even improved from its pre-earthquake state, the way cities sometimes are after disasters force modernization. What he found was a different town entirely. Simple wooden structures, he wrote in his journal, hastily constructed, as if thrown together by people without resources or skill for anything permanent. That entry sat on the page like a discordant note, because it didn't match the economic logic. New Madrid was strategically located at the intersection of major trade routes. Even after earthquakes, that geography didn't change. The motivation to rebuild properly, to invest in solid construction that could support commerce, should have been strong. But what bothered me even more was what came next in Schoolcraft's journal. He noted that he'd specifically sought out accounts from before the earthquakes. He'd read Lewis and Clark's expedition notes from 1803, Timothy Flint's missionary reports from 1811, just months before the first quake, and they described New Madrid very differently. Respectable buildings of brick and stone, Flint had written. Well-constructed houses of hewn logs, Lewis had noted. Substantial outbuildings that spoke of established commerce and successful agriculture. The town Schoolcraft was looking at in 1821, the one right in front of him, had none of that. Not rebuilt brick, not reconstructed stone, not even evidence that brick or stone had been used before. Just wood, simple construction, almost primitive in its basic functionality. Schoolcraft stood there looking at a frontier settlement that seemed to have no connection to the descriptions from a decade earlier. Like the previous town had been erased from existence, not just destroyed by earthquakes. That's when I started digging deeper into what actually happened during those earthquakes. And what I found was stranger than I expected. On December 16th, 1811, at 2:15 in the morning, something happened that hundreds of people across multiple states documented in journals, letters, and newspaper accounts. Something that still seems impossible when you read the original descriptions. The Mississippi River ran backwards, not metaphorically. Not as exaggeration or storytelling embellishment. The Mississippi River, one of the largest, most powerful rivers in North America, stopped flowing south toward the Gulf of Mexico, reversed direction, and flowed north. Witnesses watched it happen in real time. Boat captains moored at docks woke to find their vessels suddenly stranded as the riverbed around them temporarily drained, water flowing away from them instead of past them. The current they'd relied on for years simply stopped, then turned around. Water piled up in some areas, creating temporary flooding where there had been dry land moments before. Then came rushing back downstream with enough force to snap mooring lines and tear boats loose. This is documented. Contemporaneous accounts from St. Louis, New Madrid, and settlements all along the Mississippi described the same phenomenon. The river ran backwards, for hours, then gradually returned to its normal southward flow as the ground settled. Think about the force required to do that, to stop and reverse one of the continent's major rivers. The earthquake that caused it registered an estimated magnitude, 7.5 to 7.7. Ground shaking felt across more than 1 million square miles, from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast. Church bells in St. Louis rang on their own, set swinging by the ground motion. Chimneys collapsed across Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee. Forests of trees fell in unison, all tipped in the same direction by the rolling waves moving through the earth. And this was just the first earthquake. It wasn't even the largest. On January 23rd, 1812, at 9 o'clock in the morning, daylight this time, so even more witnesses, another major quake hit. Magnitude 7.3 to 7.5. Similar geographic reach. More damage to buildings that had already been weakened by the December quake. Then February 7th, 1812 at 3:45 a.m. This was the big one, possibly magnitude 8.1, the largest earthquake ever recorded in the eastern United States. This quake created Reelfoot Lake in Tennessee. Not gradually, suddenly. The ground literally dropped. An entire section of land sank, and the Mississippi River flooded into the depression, creating an 18-mile-long lake where there had been forest and farmland the day before. Witnesses described the ground rising and falling in visible waves, like ocean swells, but made of solid earth. Fissures opened, some several feet wide, and then closed again as the waves passed. Sand and water erupted from these cracks like geysers. Between the three major quakes, seismologists estimate over 2,000 aftershocks occurred, some powerful enough to cause additional structural damage. The shaking continued, on and off, for months. Near the epicenter, the New Madrid area, the landscape was completely rewritten in a matter of weeks. Forests fell. Entire groves of mature trees knocked down like dominoes. Islands in the Mississippi disappeared, swallowed by the river or torn apart by the changing currents. New islands formed from displaced sediment and collapsed riverbanks. Waterfalls appeared on the Mississippi River. Temporary waterfalls, created by sudden changes in elevation, drop-offs that hadn't existed before the ground shifted. Most of these eventually eroded away or filled in with sediment. But for months after the earthquakes, boat traffic had to navigate around previously unknown hazards. And then there was the liquefaction. The ground didn't just shake. In many areas it turned liquid. Sand blows erupted across the Mississippi Valley. Geysers of sand, silt, and pressurized water shooting 30, 40 feet into the air, then settling into massive mounds. Some of these formations were 15 feet high and spread across several acres. The soil had lost all structural integrity. And when that happens, during an earthquake, buildings don't just fall over, they sink, the ground opens as it liquefies. Structures, even heavy stone foundations, drop into these openings. Then, as the shaking stops and the liquefaction settles, the ground closes back over them, buried, sometimes in a matter of hours, certainly within days. No demolition required, no debris field to explain, just gone, swallowed by the earth. But here's what bothered me as I sat there reading Schoolcraft's journal. He was standing in a town that had supposedly been destroyed by earthquakes and then rebuilt. So where were the ruins? Where were the remnants of those brick buildings Timothy Flint had described? Where were the stone foundations that should still be visible, even if the structures above had collapsed? Earthquakes destroy buildings, yes, but they don't make stone foundations vanish. They don't erase brick entirely. There should have been debris, archaeological evidence, remnants, unless the buildings hadn't just been destroyed, unless they'd been buried. I went back to Timothy Flint's journal from 1811. I needed to see exactly what he'd documented 3 months before the first earthquake. Timothy Flint wasn't just a missionary wandering through frontier towns with a Bible and good intentions. He was educated at Harvard, classical education. He'd studied architecture as part of his training. Understanding building styles was considered essential knowledge for an educated man in that era. He knew construction techniques. He could recognize the difference between crude frontier building and sophisticated architectural work. His descriptions of New Madrid are specific, detailed, the kind of observations someone makes when they notice something unusual and want to record it properly. Respectable buildings of brick and stone, he wrote in his October 1811 entry. Not wood, like most frontier settlements. Brick and stone. Think about what that means. Brick requires kilns. Someone had to locate suitable clay, build kilns capable of reaching and maintaining the right temperatures, and produce thousands of uniform bricks. Stone construction requires quarries, skilled masons, an understanding of how to cut and shape stone properly. These aren't simple frontier techniques. These are indications of established infrastructure, investment, permanence. But it gets more interesting. Flint noted that some structures appeared quite old, built in a style not common to recent American construction. He didn't mean they looked run down or neglected. He meant the architectural style itself was unfamiliar. It didn't match the patterns he'd seen in other American frontier towns. It didn't match what he knew of typical American building techniques from that period. Different, unusual, anomalous. Then he wrote something that made me stop and reread the passage 3 times. Arched doorways and windows, of a type I have not seen elsewhere in the Western Territories. Arches, not simple rectangular openings that any carpenter could frame with basic lumber. Arched construction that requires understanding of load distribution, keystone placement, precise stonework to create the curve. It's a sophisticated architectural technique that requires training and skill. Why would frontier buildings in 1811 Missouri have arched construction? And then Flint documented something even more puzzling. Foundations of buildings, no longer standing, visible at the edge of town, constructed of fitted stone blocks. I had to look up what fitted stone blocks meant in architectural terminology to make sure I was understanding him correctly. Fitted blocks are stones cut to precise dimensions and assembled so tightly that mortar isn't necessary, or if mortar is used, it's barely visible in the seams. This is an advanced masonry technique, the kind of thing you see in old European cathedrals or Roman aqueducts, precision cutting, careful assembly, not something you'd expect in a frontier Missouri settlement, and these weren't foundations of recent buildings that had burned or collapsed. Flint specifically said they were visible at the edge of town, ruins, already there when he arrived, already partially buried by accumulated soil, already forgotten by the current residents, evidence of construction that predated not just the current buildings, but possibly the entire American settlement, ruins from something older. Flint was puzzled by them. He recorded their existence, noted the unusual construction technique, and moved on. He didn't have an explanation for who had built them or when. He was a missionary, not an archaeologist. He just documented what he saw. 3 months later, on December 16th, 1811 at 2:15 in the morning, the ground started shaking, and everything Flint had described, the brick buildings, the arched doorways, the fitted stone foundations, all of it was about to disappear. When I tried to find follow-up accounts, reports of what happened to those brick buildings, those arched structures, those stone foundations, I found silence. Henry Schoolcraft's journal from 1821, wooden structures, are no brick, no stone. Isaac McCoy, another missionary, passed through in 1828. He described New Madrid as indistinguishable from other frontier towns, log cabins and simple frames. Within 20 years, the architecture Timothy Flint had documented disappeared from the record entirely. The official explanation? The earthquakes destroyed everything, and people rebuilt with limited resources. Except those stone foundations Flint saw in 1811 were already ruins before the earthquakes, already evidence of something older. And then the earthquakes buried them completely. That's when I started looking at the geology. Geologists studying the new Madrid seismic zone found something interesting in the sand blows. Sand blows are markers, layers that stack up like tree rings. Each layer represents a major seismic event. By studying them, geologists can determine when previous earthquakes occurred. They found evidence of at least 4 previous major earthquake sequences, one around 900 AD, one around 1450 AD, one around 300 AD. The 1450 AD event was about 350 years before 1811, right in the middle of what researchers studying Tartaria describe as the height of the global civilization, advanced architecture, sophisticated infrastructure still visible in remnants across Old World cities. If structures existed in the Mississippi Valley in 1450, advanced structures precisely built, a massive earthquake series would have damaged them, destroyed some, buried others, but 350 years is enough time for nature to recover, for new settlements to be built on older foundations, for people to forget what was there originally. By 1800, when American settlers started documenting the valley, any structures from 1450 would be ancient, overgrown, partially buried. They might be described vaguely as old buildings of unknown origin. Then, 1811, another massive earthquake series. Same zone, same liquefaction, same burial mechanism. Whatever had survived from 1450 or earlier would have been finished. And the geology supports this. Liquefaction doesn't discriminate. It buries whatever is on the surface when the ground turns liquid. Stone foundations from 1450, brick buildings from 1750, wooden structures from 1810, all of it under the same displaced sand. Mixed debris from different periods, buried at the same time, unless someone excavated specifically looking for patterns, architectural styles that didn't match the timeline, it would just be labeled earthquake debris. But there's another part of this story that made me use the word reset. In 1815, Congress passed an act for the relief of the inhabitants of the Lake County of New Madrid. Compassionate disaster relief, right? The act authorized certificates. If you'd lost property in the earthquakes, the government would give you a certificate to claim equivalent land elsewhere. Except the program almost immediately became one of the largest land fraud schemes in early American history. The problem was verification. Most property records had been destroyed. Buildings were gone. Physical evidence of ownership had been swallowed by liquefied earth. So claims relied on witness testimony, which created opportunity. People who'd never lived near New Madrid filed claims. They found accomplices who would testify, for a price, that they'd witnessed the claimant's extensive holdings. One documented case, a man who claimed to have lost 5 separate properties. Over 3,000 acres worth of certificates. He produced witnesses who corroborated everything. Years later, investigators discovered he'd never lived in Missouri. Pennsylvania land speculator. Paid for false testimony. The fraud was so widespread that Congress passed additional acts in 1824 and 1826 trying to clean it up. But by then, tens of thousands of acres had already been claimed. And here's the critical part. The certificates could be used anywhere in the Louisiana Territory. Someone claiming they'd lost a cabin in New Madrid could claim 640 acres of prime farmland in Arkansas, or Illinois, or Iowa. Land that might have been under indigenous or French or Spanish claims was now being redistributed to American settlers with federal earthquake certificates. Within 10 years, land ownership across the Mississippi Valley was restructured. Old claims, indigenous, French colonial, Spanish grants, superseded by new American claims backed by federal certificates. The earthquakes provided the physical reset, buried infrastructure, destroyed buildings, created chaos. The relief program provided the legal reset, wiped out old ownership, established new patterns. Whether this was planned or opportunistic doesn't change the effect. A complete restructuring of who owned what in one of the most economically important regions of North America. Old structures buried under 30 feet of liquefied ground. Old legal claims erased by federal programs. New ownership established. And within a generation, nobody remembered what had been there before the ground opened up. Your book calls the 1811 to 1812 New Madrid earthquakes the Great Reset. And when I look at the timing, that term makes sense. 1811 to 1812 falls in the middle of the Tartarian decline period, the decades when advanced architecture was disappearing from records worldwide, when populations were being displaced, when the narrative about who built what started to change. In Europe, the Napoleonic Wars were rewriting borders. In the Americas, indigenous populations were being forced onto reservations. In Asia, colonial powers were restructuring trade routes. And in the Mississippi Valley, the most important transportation corridor in North America, massive earthquakes buried whatever infrastructure existed, all in the same general time frame, all contributing to global restructuring. As sophisticated structures existed along the Mississippi, trading centers, engineering works, infrastructure built by previous civilizations, they would have represented competition. Evidence that people had been managing these resources successfully long before European-style systems moved in. The earthquakes buried all of it. Convenient for anyone wanting to establish new control without having to explain what was there before. By the 1830s, travelers passing through New Madrid didn't know there had ever been anything different. The descriptions from Lewis and Clark, forgotten. Timothy Flint's observations about unusual architecture disappeared from the narrative. The fitted stone foundations he'd seen as ruins in 1811, buried so deep that new construction never encountered them, the same pattern shows up elsewhere. After the 1871 Chicago fire, within a generation, people forgot what pre-fire architecture looked like. After the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, same thing. After major disasters, collective amnesia sets in. The before times fade. People accept the post-disaster reality as how things have always been. The earthquakes happened. That's documented by hundreds of witnesses. The destruction was real. The Mississippi River actually ran backwards. But what was destroyed is the question. Maybe it was just frontier settlements, simple wooden structures that collapsed and were rebuilt. Or maybe it was something older, something sophisticated enough that an educated missionary in 1811 noticed its unusual construction style. Something built with fitted stone blocks and arched windows that didn't match American frontier architecture. Something that had already started falling into ruins before the earthquakes even happened. Ruins from an earlier period that nobody could explain. The ground keeps those secrets now. Buried under sand blows and displaced soil in 200 years of new construction? The official story is geology, tectonic plates, natural disaster. And that's true. The New Madrid seismic zone is a real geological feature with a documented history going back thousands of years. But the timing is still interesting. Well, the economic consequences are still interesting. The burial of previous infrastructure is still interesting. And the way a natural disaster cleared the ground for American expansion into a region that travelers had described as already having well-established and unusual construction. That's interesting too. Your book calls it the Great Reset, more than a natural disaster. A reset of what existed before. A clearing of the board. New rules, new ownership, new infrastructure, sophisticated construction described before the quakes, simpler construction appearing after, economic mechanisms that redistributed land ownership across an entire region. And within decades, nobody remembering what had really been there. The earthquakes were real. The burial was real. What was buried is the question. What Timothy Flint saw in 1811 that didn't match frontier architecture. What Lewis and Clark noticed in 1803 that used unfamiliar construction methods. What ruins with fitted stone blocks were already visible before the earthquakes even began. Unless someone excavates those sand blows, looks beneath the surface, sees what the 1811 to 1812 earthquakes really swallowed. Until then, there's the official story. Natural disaster that destroyed frontier settlements. And there's your book's version, The Great Reset, a convenient catastrophe that erased sophisticated infrastructure and made way for a new system. Nature did the work so thoroughly that proving what existed before became impossible. The earthquakes were real. The burial was real. What was lost is the question. And why some people call it a reset instead of just a disaster.